You know, when you picture a war zone, the lines usually seem pretty clear. Like, you have combatants entrenched on one side, combatants entrenched on the other, and then caught somewhere in the middle as the peacemaker, right?
Right, the mediator.
Exactly. And I think we all tend to operate on this baked-in assumption that the person holding the white flag, the one stepping right between the gunfire, is just, well, the safest person on the battlefield.
Yeah, it is a really comforting image. The whole idea of this untouchable, completely neutral party standing above the fray, and they're just universally respected by everyone holding a weapon.
But the reality on the ground is really fractured. And the peace deals that those envoys are, risking their lives to broker are unraveling faster than ever. It's wild, but the people trying to stop the world's worst conflicts are actually in more danger right now than the combatants themselves.
It's a massive paradox, yeah. And it's exactly what we need to unpack today.
That is the mission for today's deep dive. We are looking at an incredible stack of sources. We've got excerpts from the newly launched World Mediation Report 2026 out of Doha, a supporting academic review on peacemaking norms, and this fascinating, deeply practical guide called The Architecture of Inclusion from the DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute.
It's a great stack.
It really is, and our goal is to figure out exactly why the global architecture of peace is just, collapsing. We're going to explore the severe, really hidden risks that mediators face today, and then extract the practical lessons you can actually use to resolve conflicts in your own life, whether you're dealing with a hostile corporate boardroom or just a fractured family dynamic.
But before we jump into the mechanics of all this, I think we really need to set a crucial ground rule for you, the listener, because the research we're analyzing today, it examines some highly charged, ongoing conflict.
Right, very sensitive stuff.
Exactly. We'll be looking at places like Gaza, Israel, and Sudan. And it is absolutely vital to understand that in discussing these examples, we are strictly reporting on the mechanics of mediation and diplomacy as they are laid out in our sources.
Yeah, we're definitely not taking any political sides here.
No, not at all. And we are certainly not endorsing any viewpoints regarding the conflicts themselves. Our sole focus is just to pull back the curtain on how peace is negotiated behind closed doors and, well, why those doors keep getting blown off their hinges.
Perfectly said. So, starting off, the central thesis of the 2026 World Mediation Report is an incredibly sobering place to begin. It basically outlines a world where global conflict is undeniably rising, while the actual rules and guardrails that undergird peace processes are simultaneously collapsing.
Yeah, the report describes this as a reprioritization of military over political means, which is a heavy phrase, but it basically means the global order has undergone a profound shift.
Right, because for decades, the international community basically relied on this multilateral, UN-led approach to peacemaking, right?
Exactly. You had the UN Charter, you had broad international coalitions, and these massive institutions really acted as anchors for diplomacy. But as trust in those institutions has waned over time, we're seeing this dramatic drift toward what they call minilateral and bilateral deals.
Wait, minilateral. So that's just, what, a few powerful actors getting together in a room to hammer out a deal and completely bypassing the whole international community.
That is the absolute core of it. We live in a multipolar world now, and it's driven by intense great power rivalry. And rather than solving conflicts, that rivalry is actively freezing them. So instead of broad coalitions doing, long-term institution building and addressing the actual root causes of a war.
Which takes years, obviously.
Right, it takes a massive commitment. But instead of that, these fragmented actors are favoring highly transactional, really short-term truce deals. They basically just want the shooting to stop for 5 minutes.
Just a quick pause.
Yeah, and often it's simply to serve their own geopolitical or economic interests rather than to actually build a lasting peace.
So, to put it in perspective, it's like instead of a team of doctors working together to reset a broken bone so it heals properly, we just have random people rushing in to slap a Band-Aid on it to stop the bleeding in the short term, which essentially guarantees it'll just break again later.
That's a perfect analogy, yeah. And when that bone inevitably breaks again, trust in the very concept of diplomacy erodes even further. Like, this fragmented Band-Aid diplomacy leaves the world with highly militarized responses.
Because the underlying infections are just left completely untouched.
Exactly. The systemic inequalities, the territorial grievances, nobody's dealing with them, peace efforts are marginalized, and the diplomatic environment becomes incredibly chaotic and just hostile.
Which really begs a terrifying question. I mean, if the structure of global diplomacy is collapsing and the established rules of engagement are being tossed out the window, what happens to the actual individuals who are physically standing in the middle of that room? The mediators themselves.
Well, they are walking into a legal and physical void. In international law, the research calls this a legal lacuna, basically a massive gap.
A gap. How big of a gap are we talking about?
It's staggering, honestly. The legal analysis in the sources points to the reality that there is absolutely no comprehensive international law that guarantees a mediator's safety.
Wait, hold on. I mean, I'm struggling to square that with things like the Geneva Conventions.
Right.
Don't we have a massive, century-old framework of diplomatic immunity and protected status for exactly this reason?
You would definitely think so.
Yeah. How is it possible that a mediator stepping into a literal war zone has no official international legal shield?
Here is where the legal wording gets incredibly pedantic and, frankly, very dangerous. So traditional international humanitarian law, or IHL, it does not explicitly list mediators as protected persons in the same way it lists, say, medical personnel or the Red Cross.
Oh, wow. I had no idea.
Yeah, and diplomatic immunity. That only covers you if you are an official, recognized state envoy. And even then, that coverage just evaporates the second your specific mission ends.
So if you're not an official state envoy, like if you're a non-state mediator or an NGO worker or even just a local community leader stepping in to negotiate a ceasefire between two neighborhoods, you have zero formal international protection.
Zero. You are completely exposed, and it's hard to believe the UN hasn't just drafted a universal law explicitly protecting anyone engaged in mediation, right?
Seriously?
Yeah.
It seems like an obvious fix. Why hasn't that happened?
Because this legal lacuna isn't a bureaucratic accident, it is entirely intentional. Nation-states intentionally leave these rules vague because they refuse to grant any sort of legitimacy to non-state actors or rebel groups.
Oh, I see. So if a government writes a law that legally protects a mediator who goes to talk to a rebel militia, the government feels like they are indirectly recognizing that militia as a valid political entity.
Exactly. So they leave the legal gap open, which means mediators are out there relying entirely on the momentary goodwill of the combatants.
Man, relying on goodwill in a war zone is just a catastrophic insurance policy. And the sources break the consequences of that gap down into 4 distinct compounding risks.
Right. Let's get into those.
So the first, obviously, is physical violence. Spoilers, the armed groups or political factions that actually benefit financially or politically from a conflict continuing, they frequently target mediators just to blow up the peace process.
And we've seen this happen over and over. There are historical tragedies like the UN's first Arab-Israeli mediator, Count Folke Bernadotte. He was assassinated back in 1948.
And Arsala Rahmani, right, the really senior Afghan mediator who was gunned down in Kabul in 2012.
Yes, exactly. But the danger is definitely not relegated to history. Look at the chilling precedent set just recently in October 2025.
Right, the airstrike in Doha.
Yeah, there was an Israeli airstrike on Qatari soil targeting a Hamas political office, and that strike killed a Qatari security officer and wounded several mediators.
Which is wild, because Doha has historically functioned as this sort of diplomatic Geneva of the Middle East, right? Like a supposedly untouchable, completely neutral hosting ground for negotiations.
It was. But when airstrikes hit the mediators in the designated safe zone, it signals to the entire diplomatic community that the concept of a sanctuary is just dead. Like nowhere is safe anymore.
The physical risk is paramount, obviously, but it bleeds directly into the second risk the sources identify, which is legal vulnerability. Because they operate in this void we talked about, mediators basically survive purely on informal political assurances.
Which is essentially extortion.
Exactly. If a conflict actor suddenly decides they just don't like the direction the talks are going, they can arbitrarily accuse the mediator of bias.
And then that mediator could face sudden legal reprisals or international sanctions or even prosecution back in their home country simply because there is no established system of law defending their actions.
Right. It fundamentally alters how the mediator does their job.
Yeah.
I mean, if you know your physical safety relies on the temporary patience of a warlord, you are severely discouraged from bringing up tough, necessary issues.
Exactly. You might completely avoid discussing war crimes or human rights abuses at the table because doing so might result in your safe passage being revoked.
You're basically silenced before you even sit down. And if they don't threaten you legally, they target the third risk, which is your reputation. I mean, Credibility is a mediator's only actual currency.
It's everything, and spoiler groups know this. They use highly coordinated misinformation campaigns to absolutely destroy a mediator's perceived neutrality.
The sources mention Kofi Annan and Staffan de Mistura, right, when they served as UN envoys to Syria.
Yeah, that's a perfect example. Both factions in that conflict weaponized the media against them. They were publicly smearing their characters, accusing them of deeply entrenched bias, and effectively slapping them with travel bans.
Which is crazy. But if you lose your impartiality in the eyes of even one party, the entire mediation effort is doomed. Extremists can silence moderate diplomatic voices simply by dragging the mediator's name through the mud until they are forced to resign.
And when you are constantly walking that impossible tightrope, knowing that one wrong word could result in a coordinated smear campaign, a travel ban, or, get you killed in an airstrike, the human brain simply cannot sustain that level of hypervigilance.
Which leads right into the unseen fourth risk, the psychological toll. Working amid extreme violence with absolutely no safety net, carrying the responsibility for millions of civilian lives, the emotional damage is profound.
The data on this is really upsetting. The sources highlight a 2024 study that tracked 28 highly experienced women mediators.
And what did they find?
They were operating with massive, debilitating burnout, secondary trauma, anxiety, and severe sleep loss. And what's deeply troubling about that psychological toll is the absolute vacuum of institutional support.
Yeah, the research mentioned that formal psychosocial support is incredibly rare for these folks.
Exactly. Despite the immense moral injury and PTSD these mediators face, especially the women who report unique compounding strains regarding their personal safety and threats against their families, they are basically left on their own.
So a regional body might provide you with an armed security advisor, but mental health care is mostly just left to personal self-care on the side.
Yeah, exactly. Self-care in an active war zone. It's just absurd.
Completely absurd. So if active war zones have become this physical, legal, and psychological meat grinder for the people trying to stop the fighting, the global strategy obviously has to shift. You basically have to stop the violence before the shooting actually starts.
And this is the exact pivot the international diplomatic community is agonizing over right now. If crisis management is failing so spectacularly, the focus must shift to preventive mediation.
Right. Early dialogue. Engaging aggressively to head off violence before it reaches an explosive threshold. And the statistical data backing up this shift in the sources is striking.
It really is. Preventive mediation boasts a 64% success rate in low-intensity disputes.
64% is pretty good. But then the data shows that the second those fatalities cross the 10,000 mark, that success rate plummets to 39%.
Exactly. Because once the existential stakes are set and the blood is spilled, even the best envoys in the world cannot put the genie back in the bottle. Once 10,000 people have died, the psychology of the conflict fundamentally mutates.
It's no longer just about the original grievance, like land or resources.
Yeah.
It becomes about vengeance.
Right. The sunk cost fallacy really kicks in for the leadership. I mean, a leader cannot look at their constituents, justify 10,000 dead sons and daughters, and then agree to a compromise that just returns things to the status quo.
They need a massive, total victory to justify the bloodshed, which makes diplomatic compromise almost statistically impossible.
Precisely. You have to catch it early. And Guinea between 2008 and 2010 is a perfect case study of this working. Following a coup, the UN and the African Union engaged very early with the military leaders and the civilian opposition.
They didn't wait for a civil war to erupt.
No, they didn't. They used a highly coordinated combination of threatened international sanctions and economic incentives, and they successfully transitioned the country toward civilian elections.
And Lebanon is another great example, right? From 2011 to 2017, quiet, sustained, behind-the-scenes mediation managed to contain the violent spillover from the Syrian war next door.
Yeah, that was a huge success. But early engagement is not a magical cure-all. It requires relentless institutional follow-through. Look at Sudan in 2010 and 2011, or Yemen in 2011.
The textbook examples of fragile, ultimately failed preventive mediation.
Right. In both cases, international mediators rushed in, secured these initial transitional power-sharing deals, and successfully stopped the immediate collapse of the state.
But then they just slapped the fresh coat of paint on the building and walked away.
Exactly the problem. Because there was no sustained enforcement mechanism, no deep institutional reform, and no long-term backing from the international community once the cameras left, the power vacuums just remained.
And both countries ultimately descended into devastating, protracted wars just a few years later. An early signature on a piece of paper is incredibly fragile if the mediators just pack up and go home.
Yeah, doesn't mean anything long-term.
I do have to push back on the ethics of this entire preventative approach, though. I mean, the research dedicates a lot of ink to a major ethical debate here.
It's a huge point of contention.
Right. Because if the goal is just to prevent a war at all costs, and we rush in early to negotiate with armed warlords or coup leaders, aren't we basically colluding with impunity? Don't we risk letting massive human rights violators entirely off the hook just to secure a ceasefire?
You are hitting on the absolute most profound tension tearing at the field of diplomacy today. It is the brutal debate between prevention and justice. Practitioners struggle with this impossible choice every single day.
Because it's a catch-22.
It really is. If you walk into a room and demand strict accountability for war crimes up front, the armed actors will simply walk away from the table and tens of thousands of civilians will die in the ensuing war.
But if you sweep those crimes under the rug to get a peace deal, you legitimize thugs, you entrench corrupt leadership, and you lay the exact groundwork for future violence.
It's an agonizing calculus, and the research adds another layer of manipulation to this, which they call bureaucratic prevention.
Bureaucratic prevention, what's that?
This is when governments or armed militias pretend to engage in early good faith negotiations. They pay lip service to the mediators, they host the meetings, but in reality, they are just using the diplomatic talks to buy time.
Oh, wow, so they're just stalling to rearm, reposition their troops, and prepare for a massive offensive.
Exactly. The mediator unwittingly becomes a pawn in their military strategy. So getting people to the table early is vital, but the illusion of peace shatters entirely depending on who is actually permitted to sit at that table.
Which brings us to the final, and perhaps most critical, piece of the puzzle. The architecture of inclusion. And this is where the insights from the DC Mediation and Dispute Resolution Institute really shine.
They really do. Their whole framework centers heavily on a phrase born directly from grassroots backlash.
They signed a deal about us without us.
Yes. When the official participant circles are kept deliberately narrow, just the guys holding the guns and the elite diplomats in bespoke suits, the excluded public will inevitably revolt.
And we see this structural failure globally. Like during the 2019 to 2020 U.S. Taliban talks in Doha, the process essentially excluded the actual Afghan government and completely sidelined Afghan women.
Right. And in Syria, the Constitutional Committee shut out key Kurdish communities. And look at Colombia in 2016. The government and the FARC rebels spent years negotiating this massive comprehensive peace accord.
But when they confidently put that elite agreement to a public referendum, it failed at the ballot box.
Because the everyday constituencies felt they're highly specific, local grievances were completely ignored by the elites sitting in Havana.
There is a quote from Sudanese women in the source material that perfectly captures this betrayal, and it just stuck with me. They said, "You thank us in demonstrations and forget about us in negotiations."
It's heartbreaking. They were the ones putting their bodies on the line, protesting in the streets. But when it came time to actually draft the legal future of their country, the doors were locked from the inside.
Sometimes, mediators attempt to solve this public relations nightmare with what the Institute calls symbolic representation.
Right, where they'll place, say, 2 women or 2 minority representatives at a negotiating table of 50 men and publicly declare it an inclusive process.
Which is basically the equivalent of inviting someone to a dinner party but making them sit in the corner without a plate or silverware.
Okay.
I mean, it's a cynical photo op. It is not actual inclusion.
Not at all.
In fact, it breeds even more resentment because it's deeply insulting. You're pretending to give a marginalized group a voice while actively starving them of any real structural influence over the outcome.
And what's fascinating about the DC Mediation Institute's findings is that this dynamic is not just a quirk of high-level international diplomacy. It is a fundamental law of human behavioral psychology.
Right. The exact same feelings of disenfranchisement and resentment that tank a national peace accord in Colombia are the ones that destroy trust in everyday life. This applies directly to you, the listener.
Absolutely. The same mechanics that break a ceasefire will break a corporate merger.
Think about a workplace. If you're an executive and you resolve a heated structural dispute between 2 department heads behind closed doors, but you completely blindside the rest of the staff who actually has to implement the new workflow, that agreement is dead on arrival.
The team will passively or actively resist it because they had no agency in creating it.
Or consider settling a family estate. You and your sibling might sit down and perfectly balance the finances on paper, But if you completely ignore the underlying emotional grievance of a third sibling who always felt left out of family decisions,
Mm.
well, the paper might be legally binding, but the family unit is permanently shattered.
And people often use the excuse that inclusion slows down the process, right? They argue that it's too complicated to have 30 different voices weigh in on a crisis.
But the data proves that bringing voices in early is the only thing that actually makes the resolution bear weight over time.
Look at South Sudan's 2018 Revitalized Agreement. After years of relentless pressure from civil society, they built in a strict, legally binding 35% women's participation quota.
When you genuinely engage the stakeholders who have to live with the consequences of the deal, you aren't just slapping paint on a crack, you're actually pouring a new concrete foundation.
Exactly. So today, we've mapped out the crumbling norms of global peacemaking. We've explored how the glaring lack of international legal protection is putting mediators directly in the crosshairs of physical, legal, and severe psychological danger.
And we analyze the psychology behind why catching conflicts early is our best statistical hope, despite the grueling ethical compromises involved. And ultimately, we prove that a closed-door deal is destined to fail, whether that door belongs to a presidential palace or your local human resources department.
The ultimate takeaway for you is that conflict, whether it's geopolitical or deeply personal, does not have to be something you fear. Conflict is an opportunity to expose rotting foundations and build stronger, more durable systems in their place.
But that only happens if you utilize the tools of true inclusion and radical transparency. You have to ensure that every single person affected by a decision has a genuine empowered hand in shaping it.
Which brings up a really interesting thought. If international law continues to fail so spectacularly at protecting high-profile, elite global envoys, it really forces us to rethink the entire paradigm of diplomacy.
It absolutely leaves us with a lingering question to ponder. Because perhaps the future of durable peace doesn't lie with elite diplomats flying in from afar on private jets. Perhaps the real solution is finding a way to legally empower, fund, and protect the local grassroots mediators.
The community leaders who are already on the ground living inside the conflict.
The ones who actually know how to heal the bone. Keep that paradigm shift in mind next time you find yourself caught in the middle of a war zone, no matter how big or small.